Good Thursday evening to all of you attending the Bible Institute of Zagreb's Discipleship Conference. My name is Dennis Allen, and I'm coming to you from the northwest side of Washington, D.C. in the United States. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there with you in person. I hope to see you sometime soon. I hope your time is very productive and encouraging in your service to Christ, and I am so very grateful to Professor Irvin for all his hard work to pull all of us together. I hope you're letting him know that as well. This paper is entitled Headwinds in Discipleship. How can we climb the heights of biblical education without a disciple's sure foundation first? There was a similar version of this paper that I presented to the chief academic officers of the United States Accreditation Board for Christian Schools and Seminaries, the ABHE, last year, to their chief academic officers. The material is an extension of research that we've done for the book, The Disciple Dilemma. Incidentally, that book's coming out in Croatian in a few months, I think, there as well. The gist of the paper is that Western discipleship has been truncated and that the impairment of discipleship bleeds over beyond individual disciples into churches and, more alarmingly, into the vitality of Christian schools and seminaries in the West, the feedstock of our pastors and our Christian leaders. Such Western trends also appear to be poised to migrate into Central European churches and schools as well, hence the paper. I want to emphasize that what I'm talking about is not due to a failure on your part, nor is it the local church's fault. This is a tragedy and a tradition of many centuries of things not going well pursuing discipleship. So I'd like to talk about three things in this brief paper: the key symptoms, the headwinds, as it were, that are facing disciples in the West and that I think migrate your way. Then getting to the cause. What's going on underneath us? Why is this happening? And then finally, to outline a biblical path forward, the idea of imperial discipleship. And we'll define what that idea of imperial discipleship means. Let me start with adverse trends on the campuses of Christian schools and seminaries. I'm going to use a chart. Here are 4 business quadrants shown. They're analytical quadrants in the evaluation of businesses. They're used by many in the commercial world to evaluate health and vitality of an organization. The grid plots changes in the enrollment of headcount between the years 2015 and 2023, an 8-year period, in the vertical, the up and the down. The midline being headcount gain above, headcount loss below. The change in financial investments, think about cash flow and funds for staffing, improvements, and maintenance, move left and right across the grid over the same time period. So the dotted lines demarcate growth versus reductions. Now, these 4 quadrants that then emerge from the 2 dotted lines being perpendicular define the vibrancy and vitality of institutions. For example, the upper right quadrant is labeled thriving. What that means is that headcount is increasing and that investment in that particular school and campus is increasing. The bottom right quadrant is labeled hoping. And what that means is we're hoping to catch up. Our headcount is going down, but our investment is up, so we're hoping to catch up. The upper left quadrant is labeled inertia, where headcount is actually growing, but we've stopped making investments, so we're running on the inertia of those schools. The lower left-hand quadrant is called struggling. Headcount is shrinking, investments are going down too. Now, we plotted 234 of the approximately 350 Christian higher education universities and seminaries in the US and Canada on this grid. And the dots that you'll see appearing here illustrate the absolute value change in enrollment and operating investment over that 8-year period. So as you look at this scatter of the 234 schools, where they land, which quadrant they land, and that shows you what's happened between 2015 and 2023 with their finances and their headcount. Now, the question that we want to raise is, do we have a problem? At first glance, these dots look okay, more or less grouped around the middle, right? But here's an orange circle to give you a best fit look at where the numbers actually fall on this scatter. Notice that the orange cross-haired circle is right on the verge of struggling and hoping and below in terms of headcount. So we're losing headcount and we're just barely holding even on the investment flow that we've got. Now let's compare that to a secular school. This blue circle is the center point for secular schools using the same criteria taken from a Wall Street Journal survey published this past August. The journal made the point that most secular schools, having even lost their state and federal funds, continue to thrive. Notice their superior position on the chart. So what does this grid tell us? Well, if you take a look at the count of the dots, 67% of the dots are trapped in the struggling and the hoping quadrants. If you bring in the inertia quadrant, the upper left quadrant, 73% in total of all these dots, which represent schools, are at risk. As a perspective for you, if you fit in one of these three quadrants, then 3/4 of you would fail in those three quadrants within the next 5 years. That's documented research. Two common symptoms that we hear from Christian higher education and from seminaries. Biblical literacy in the West is in obvious decline with the students coming in. Secondly, anxiety and stress among these students is eating up budgets and overwhelming the staff. All of these trends, headcount, finance, anxiety, biblical literacy, they're all actually symptoms of a deeper thing. These are just the surface symptoms. The trends are pointing to causes, that there is something root beneath the surface that has to be identified and worked with. And I'm going to lean you into the idea that it's the failure of discipleship. But let's tour some more symptoms to help highlight the cause and then a way forward out of it. The problem that we face is deeper than just the campus numbers that we've just looked at. Here's a chart called a religiosity index. It was published by Professor J. Tobin Grant. There are a number of these out, and they all seem to be eerily consistent. This one was published in the peer-reviewed journal, The Sociological Spectrum. Notice that this tracks around 1998. The index tilts steeply, precipitously downward. This is the emergence of what we call the nones and the dones. Now, we can bring up an issue here. The local church often supplies you as educators with your students. Is that a good thing? Well, here's a chart to start with. Going back to 1972 through the year 2010, the black and the gray lines at the bottom represent people who attend church occasionally. The black and the gray lines. Not much change on those two lines over the 38 years. They're pretty much together. But look at the red and the blue lines at the top. This is significant. The blue are the weekly attenders, and they've swapped out with the red lines, the nevers. The swap between the blue and the red line at the top, 5 million people who are weekly attenders are gone, swapped out with the nevers and the rarelies. Many of you as millennials were teenagers during that period. Now let's bring it a little closer to the present. Here's two studies merged together, one 2007 through 2014, the other 2009 through 2019, so essentially a 12-year period, tracking the shift in Western Christian behavior. Notice the tilt downward on the upper line, the blue line, Protestant, and the line below that, the Catholic line. Notice the uptick on the gray and the magenta lines at the bottom, the nothings and the agnostics. If you merge these two studies together, looking at these people on the Protestant, Catholic, atheist, and agnostics, what you're seeing are 33 million people exiting Christianity between 2007 and 2019. This all suggests that not only are today's students awash in this spiritual exit, but the parents are probably part of this deforming trend as well. It's no longer the exodus as we think of the Old Testament, but it's the exit, E-X-I-T, the exit us from Christianity. A lot of followers are not following Christ anymore. Christian culture was changing during those years, and it is changing today. And why? And what does that mean for you? Now, as leaders, we often assume in our churches and our schools that things are going well with the students and the congregations. That's not a new story. Neither is it an accurate one. I want to read a paragraph from 1797, William Wilberforce, the great emancipator. Here's Wilberforce's statement. He was born in a Christian country. Of course he is a Christian. His father was a member of the Church of England. So is he. When such is the hereditary religion handed down from generation to generation, it cannot surprise us to observe young men of sense and spirit beginning to doubt altogether the truth of the system in which they've been brought up. It's very hard to pass on and thrive in that which we do not have. Here's a startling statistic. Less than 20% of pastors in the West say that they have ever been discipled. And the surveys indicate that less than 10% of laymen have ever been discipled. We like to think about discipleship originating and flourishing in churches, but the statistics say that we're losing in that fight, not gaining followers. So let's consider some recently documented trends and ask ourselves, is something wrong? The nones and the dones that we mentioned earlier in the West, 6 out of 10 millennials and Generation Zs, think age 45 and down, who've been raised in U.S. churches have walked away and they don't appear to be coming back. A third of the Christians that still stick around in the pews say, it's not my job to talk about my faith. More than a third think 40% of attending evangelicals say Jesus is not the only way to God. Inert Christianity rampages at the level of 82% in the pews. What is inert Christianity? I have no prayer life. I have no personal Bible study. I have no close Christian community. And I go to church 1.7 times a month. That's the average. That's 82% of the people in the pews. Then we have the muted, meaning there's no noise coming out of their mouth, or the uns, meaning unable, unwilling, unprepared to talk about Christ or to give a reason for the hope within them. That's 93% of the people in the pews. No conversation about Christ with anyone outside the church for a year or longer. And then spiritual distancing. Over half of believers today in the West say that their life in Christ is their personal matter, off limits to everyone else. We don't have time to really talk about some of the other subjects I brought up, nationalism, tribalism, power, and abuse. But the pressures against discipling in the Christian community that we've listed here are creeping in. They're creeping in socially from the outside society. They're creeping in economically, pressures against the church and against our schools. And of course, they're creeping in spiritually, and they're creeping toward Europe just as well. Christian schools and seminaries should not, they cannot compete with secular schools using the strengths of the secular schools, which are significant capital, significant facilities, large venues, and of course, religious apathy. You don't want to fight on those terms. Christian schools, raising up Christian followers, need to fight on their terms with their strengths. Christian schools have a secret weapon, just as the churches do. 4 key biblical themes. And those themes are meaning, purpose, identity, and belonging, which in aggregate are what we call discipleship. These core beliefs about myself are at the center of all human longing, and they are the 4 ideas fulfilled only in Christ. These words are the outworking of biblical discipleship. These words are the sustainable competitive advantage available to revitalize Christianity in our politics, in our societies, and certainly in Christian higher education in the West. We are a catechized West, but it happens to be catechized with Netflix, Google, Amazon, chatbots, and a lot of fake news. The catechizing of students by the external world, long before they ever come to you, cannot be out-teached and it cannot be outspent. It can only be overcome in discipleship. Now, let me say this. No business turnaround that I've ever been involved in has succeeded by throwing money and marketing and demanding harder work at people, going after the symptoms. None of that works until the mission and the culture by leaders are clear and deployed. You can't succeed. You can't outspend it. You can't outrun it. Yet rarely do I encounter leaders who understand how fundamental their role, the mission, the culture, and their specific leadership is in writing the culture of a struggling organization. So here it is then. The failure, the cause, the centerpiece of this is not the symptoms. The failure to disciple as Christ taught us to disciple. The truncation of discipling in the West is the cause of these many adverse trends we've been talking about. Let's talk about a path forward, looking past the symptoms and looking to the past, to the imperial discipleship that Jesus gave us. Imperial means sublime, heavenly, biblical, wonderful, imperial discipleship. Christ's discipleship, the Lord's version, is the only way back from these adversities. And it begins with you and with me as leaders, as discipling educators, as church leaders, but not merely in the classroom, not merely in the pews. This discipling means one-on-one, maybe one-on-two, but it means individuality as discipleship, being in relationship. And you're going to hear more about that from other speakers. I've seen that in your agenda. What's your mission in Christian higher education? Is it possible that your mission is not actually education? Could it be that that's just simply a core competency? Could it be you're in the educated disciples business and education is that primary means? Many educators claim discipleship is not their job and their educational fact infusion is. Going back to the opening title, can one actually climb the scaffold of biblical higher education without a disciple's sure foundation beneath it? Well, I think there's some headwinds if you want to try to pull that off. I want to humbly lay this idea at your feet. Your primary mission is discipleship. In kingdom impact, your mission as a church leader, a professor, or a layman is to progress and make disciples. Disciples who make disciples who make disciples. Lifelong, thriving disciple making. There's no retirement plan. That's our calling as a bondservant, as a doulos. And that's the key to the headwinds that we face. The Lord's blessing on all of you.